Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Landscape Container Gardening Virtual Workshop. For those of you that haven't joined us before, you should notice on the right-hand side of your screen that there is a Q&A session. As you think of questions or as things come up, please post your questions there and we will address them. We are excited that you're here and we hope that you will learn a lot from our expert who is sitting before you. I am just a disembodied voice, so I know that's probably a little strange. We wanted to be appropriately socially distanced. So Kirti Mathura is here to talk about landscape container gardening.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I've been living in the valley for over 30 years and just have a passion for our desert plants, both native and from other arid regions of the world. And not only can we use a lot of these plants to glorify our wonderful landscapes, but we can use them, many of them, in container situations. So I'd like to just go over some basics of our landscape container gardening. There's so many different reasons why some of us might want to include some containers. Some of us, we only have maybe patio space and we can have a sort of landscape created through the use of containers in that setting, or we might be wanting to accent our landscape or entryways and areas like that. So with our program today, just want to run through different things that you need to think about as far as where you're going to locate your containers and what is the purpose of your container or containers. We'll talk about choosing and preparing the container, soil to use, and the process of planting and caring for your container plants. And definitely we'll run through some nice selections of different plants that you might consider using for your container garden. Now, thinking about the location, one of the main things you have to assess and really study is the sun exposure. And that's not just on one day, but the sun travels through the year, and we need to know whether something's going to be in blaring sun all day, or if it might have some wonderful nice shade from perhaps a Aloe Vera tree or something like that, or whether it'll be getting morning sun and afternoon shade. All these different conditions will help guide us in selecting the most appropriate plants for the setting. Here we have a euphorbia that in a container does not do well in full sun. Just be aware, plants that we have in containers will be more greatly affected by the elements, by the sun, by heat, by cold, and so forth, than that same type of plant that's planted in the ground. So something like this pencil plant, I would really recommend that it have some midday or afternoon shade. And the image on the left, you have, there's a break in the sun pattern throughout the day. So it's not in direct sun at any, throughout the day, but it's getting a little bit of shade at various times. The example on the right is one that is set in an area where it gets very, very bright light through most of the day. Just early morning, it gets a little bit of direct sun. So that might be the ideal location or situation for plants like this. These Karu Roses, they do not fare well in direct sun during the summer months around here in the valley. So you're going to want to plant appropriately for the proper exposure. Now those are plants that don't want direct sun all day, but you have to be careful and make sure that you give plants sufficient light or sufficient direct sun exposure, such as these Mexican fence post cactus that are supposed to be nice and straight throughout their length. They have been deficient of light, and they've developed what a previous cactus guru would call pointy heads. Now this basically deformed growth is not correctable. Once they have that growth, it's for forever. So we want to make sure that the light is sufficient. That means you got to know what the plants want. If you have plants that perhaps will not endure very, very cold temperatures during the winter, you need to be aware of that. And this lovely smooth-leafed agave that's up at the right, the left, that was hit by cold, and it suffered damage on the leaf tips, and that's permanent. Mainly it's cosmetic, but that's permanent for those leaves that will be associated with that plant for many, many years. Something like this Euphorbia is much more cold hardy. And there are materials that you could use, what many of us in the horticulture industry call frost cloth, that you could protect plants that might be susceptible to freeze damage. And that usually will buy the plants maybe 2 to 3 degrees of comfort, protecting them from cold. Now, for the location, also think about the traffic flow. This is a very, very spiny, spiky Euphorbia on these steps. Well, actually, to be honest, that is a feature. Those are steps to nowhere. It's an ornamental feature. So this isn't really a concern, but if it were a staircase to be used, you'd want to choose something that wouldn't potentially harm passers-by. You'd want to perhaps choose something like these friendly succulent plants. Here we have a cactus, the totem pole, that generally doesn't have any spines, so it's very, very friendly. It can be in areas where there would be activity, and if somebody does by chance bump into it, they won't be harmed. Here is a friendly agave, the Octopus Agave. Now, the only problem with this, it doesn't have nasty teeth on it or sharp tips that will poke you, but it is somewhat fragile, somewhat brittle-leaved. So there the danger would be if somebody bumped into it, they might break a leaf off of the plant. But these are plants that wouldn't cause harm to passersby. Do you have youngsters or perhaps pets that are that type that anything they come across is fair game to put in their mouth? You don't want to have toxic plants. So you'd want to stay away from these euphorbias. We've already seen a couple of these. Here's one more relative, the slipper plant. These exude a milky sap that can be toxic. And not just for ingesting, but toxic to skin, can be a great irritant. Or something like this spiky Ocotillo relative back here. So just be aware of plants that could cause injury to youngsters or pets. Now, every container has a purpose within your arrangement. In this setting, this lovely patio setting with the flagstone and these beautiful kind of rustic carved benches, they're beautiful, but on their own, it could be a little drab. These folks kind of livened up the area with some living plants. And I think also with the choice of the purple flowers of this lavender, that's a nice combination with the rustic look of the your rustic benches there. Here, a nice container kind of accenting this bench, sitting bench, that has different nice forms and textures, and you can really have fun with your containers. Such as we see here, all kinds of sizes, shapes, textures going on with these containers. And you know, we all have different design, and whether it's interior design or outdoor in our landscape settings, you know, our ideas or preferences. So, you know, this might be a little over the top for some people, very festive, but these containers, they're very nice, kind of welcoming you in to the courtyard and up to the front door. This is a little bit more subdued. They have these nice brown containers that are lovely features, and they've got the symmetry going on rather than kind of one of this or that, as far as the plants and the containers on either side of the entryway to this courtyard. some other containers kind of greeting you as you come into these courtyard areas. And these are friendly. This is another friendly plant, the smooth leaf agave. It's kind of nice. They have a container here, and as you enter through this into this courtyard, you can see they've got more containers. So it just kind of follows through in design. As somebody approaches the front door of this house, very modern. You've got all these straight edges, linear forms, and it's, I thought, very nice that they chose this container that also has this structure more geometric in form as well. And I do want to comment here that it's very nice. They kind of complemented the golden barrels planted in the ground with a golden barrel in this container. I do offer a word of caution though. It seems like we're getting hotter and hotter during the summers, and I am seeing more of these golden barrels that are planted out in exposure of full day sun, suffering some sunburn. So in that case, that might not be so good of a choice, but I do love having that continuity from the container to the landscape itself, tying all that together. And here these big containers, I think, go so fabulously with this rusted metal gate going into the entry courtyard there. Again, they use that friendly octopus agave. And this cactus, although it does have spines, it's very upright, and there's sufficient room here that people really won't have any cause to get too close to that and get poked by any of those spines. Delightful here with this driveway and the garage door. They use these tall vertical pots and a very simple, easy to care for red yuccas, these hesperaloes that seasonally will send up these bloom stalks with these bright kind of pinkish red blooms that will also be a really nice contrast to the color of their garage door and the walls in the background. So just think of how you can tie your plants and your containers into the overall setting. You can have your container be an accent within the landscape itself. This is a rosemary, and you don't have to stick to conventional containers either. Get kind of, inventive and use different things. With this container that they've used, it's very tall and not too wide, but it works for a plant that is as rough and tough as a rosemary plant. And of course, seasonally, you'll have these lovely flowers, and this just cascades out of the container so beautifully. Here they've used these octopus agaves, a trio of them, to be a fabulous accent in this landscape setting. And it turns out this is the color, they painted the containers, and they kind of carried over color that is used on a portion of the color of around the entryway to the house. Here, seasonally getting some pops of color on this patio. In the late winter going on into the spring, you have these chartreuse blooms on this wonderful euphorbia. So again, just remember, euphorbias, if you break leaves or stems of them, generally most of them will exude a milky sap that can be a skin irritant. So we always want to keep these away from high activity. Now, some of your selections of your plants can have the added bonus of attracting hummingbirds to your gardens. Certainly during the cooler season when most of the aloes bloom, you can have that thrill of watching the hummingbirds visit the flowers for nectar. And the aloes, they range in size, shape, and color of blooms. So you can really have a lot of fun with the different aloe plants. You could perhaps even attract butterflies or other interesting creatures to your container areas with your choice of plants. So the lavenders are wonderful. They will be visited by butterflies and hummingbirds and some of our pollinator bees. Your container might even host a family. Here, some of these little doves have taken up to developing their nest and raising their young in this container here. And you can, from some local artists, you can get some very interesting different containers that are unique, one of a kind, that can be a lot of fun. So here they have these cacti that tend to kind of hang and drape, very fun, and the blooms on those seasonally will be another attraction. In this setting, we have one of our very common ice plants that seasonally in the spring can bring so much beauty and color to this combination of the giant Hesperaloe and just a nice plant being the ground cover type. It will spill over, drape over the side of the container very nicely. Seasonal color through the kind of late spring through the summer months with these Karu Roses. There's many different types of them. They will grace you with flowers that range from white to pink to red, and some of them are just fabulous. You just want to be careful. I think this is an ideal plant for containers. We don't recommend generally that these are planted in the ground because during the winter, if the soil is very, very cold and wet, these will easily rot, and that's always a sad thing, to lose one of these beauties to that unfortunate combination of cold and wet. So just think, your plants, you can have one plant in the container, one type of plant, or you could have a variety of them with this slipper plant. It's wonderful with its fun and funky flowers that attract the hummingbirds. It's nice, and these are pretty versatile. They can go in quite a bit of sun or light to even moderate shade. And here's a grouping. So just remember, with your containers, you can have a lot of fun and essentially make them into a small landscape, a miniature landscape. And they've accented this container with these fun squiggly pieces here. Also, these agaves, as they grow, they possibly within 5 years or so, 3 to 5 years, could outgrow this container. So don't always just think in terms of you plant something and that is there forever. You can change things up as plants grow and mature, and don't be afraid to use some plants just because, at maturity it'll be too big. You can certainly transplant them out into a larger container later or into a landscape setting. So thinking of containers, you have so many varieties and options out there, and I would certainly recommend just go with something that you like the looks of. Pardon me, there are benefits and drawbacks to just about any type of material. Some people feel like the terracotta or clay pots are nice because they breathe and can help with aeration of the soil. Other people like plastic or the ceramic containers because they feel like, well, that holds moisture longer. So when we get into really the hardcore summer months, advantages of moisture retention and this and that, they're minimal as long as you're caring properly for your plants. So I'd say go for something that you like the look of. When you're working with succulents, different aloes or agaves or cacti, they can be very well suited for more shallow containers because their root systems are shallow in development. You might want something deeper for shrubby materials, shrubby plants, and so forth. And you can have plants, the containers that you see here, they carry through with the same style, slightly different sizes, but same style of container with different plants in them. You can, as I mentioned before, use different things, kind of maybe repurpose items to become containers. Here we've got this nice rustic barrel and an old rusty wheelbarrow and an old wooden trough here that have become beautiful planters. Nice planters here. You have this beautiful stonework retaining wall, and these planters are stone-like and kind of blend in very well with that wall. Having taller pots, vertical pots, can be a nice break in expansive wall stretches. Here we see vertical pot 2 kind of giving a nice accent here at this corner. Nice rustic pots with this rustic looking metal bench. So I refer to plants that are higher maintenance, need higher water or fertilizer and so forth, or shade as foo-foo. A lot of our annuals, they're okay if we plant them in the appropriate season, but there are a lot of plants that are drought tolerant that could give us similar effects that wouldn't use as much water. So just by changing the container, you can have different effects where we have the same plant even. So just think in terms of having fun with different styles of containers. These are all some of those wonderful drought tolerant succulent plants. Some people call them mother-in-law's tongues, and each type of these will give you just very, very aromatic, wonderful fragrant blooms. Each type slightly different scent, but they're generally sweetly scented. Extra little bonus there. With the container choice here, this nice trio, good combination of form, color, size and height and so forth. It's a shame though that they couldn't find a container for the golden barrels that more closely match the style. I think that would have just made it that much nicer in visual effect, but this is a nice trio of your plants here. With this stone container, it's kind of fun. They have a saguaro. The gray of the spines is picked up with the patina of the stone, as well as this little mammillaria cactus and the agave here also. So of course, you can't leave the saguaro in this container forever. This agave within a few years will outgrow the setting as well, but you can have these nice plantings. And as I said, some of these plants might eventually go into a landscape when they overgrow their container. This is so fun, I think. The white papery spines of this cactus, I think it's a beautiful combination with this decorative pot that they used. Sometimes the pot is almost more so the feature than the plants that are in the container. Such as we have here, they kind of picked up on the tile numbers used in this setting, or the plant might be more so the feature. So, there are different ways to go as far as the combination of container and plants. And here's kind of nice, they kind of picked up on our primary colors with this combination of the red, yellow, and blue, and this beautiful Queen Victoria agave. Here, the container is very subdued, and the plant, especially when it's in bloom, is more so the feature being showcased here. You can use a series of pots that are all the same style and create some very nice effects. Here they've got as well a triad or trio of containers just varying in heights and sizes, and that can be very effective as a feature in your patio area or an entryway. Sometimes you want more height than a container will give you. You could use some kind of pedestal or even inverted containers as a base to give you more height. Different containers. Now, you definitely, with these moss-lined containers, have to use plants that are very drought tolerant so that you're not having to water every day. And I think this was a beautiful combination here. So once you decide on your container, the main thing is your container has to have a drainage hole. Without that, you risk having rot of the root system if the soil is overwatered. So a lot of people will use a sealant inside of a container, such as we see here, black sealant on this container also, and a white sealant. So there are different products available. Sometimes pots come with with sealer already in them, or you may need to apply some if you want to. If not, with our terracotta pots, as an example, after years of our mineral water that we have from our municipalities, you can get a high accumulation of salts on the surface of the pot that in time will also not only look kind of bad, but also eventually degrade the surface of the container. So the necessary drainage hole that you will have to cover. Okay, that sounds ridiculous, but you want to cover the hole with something that will drain, whether it's just a shard of an old container, an old pot, or you could use a coffee filter or even newspaper, something that will hold the soil in place in the container. And even if something like newspaper or an item like that is used, it will eventually disintegrate, it will degrade, but usually by then the root system of the plant that you have in the container has grown sufficiently to hold the soil in place so it doesn't wash out of the drainage hole. So I always recommend for your containers that you use a nice potting mix that will drain well. And there are different potting mixes available in different nursery centers. You can get some specialized for cacti and succulents that drain exceptionally well, or just a good basic potting soil. But it's better to go that direction than just digging up soil from out in the yard. That can cause problems with pathogens, having bacterial or fungal disease affect your plants. So one thing I want to discuss is don't line the bottom of your container with pebbles or broken up pot pieces. That does not help with drainage. With the way that water moves through the soil, water will move down, and once it gets to the point where we have this more coarse material, you'll have it drain to a point, but you won't have capillary action to pull the final amount of water down through. So it is best to just forego that, because you've just basically eliminated an inch or a couple inches of soil that the root systems could have been taking advantage of had you skipped that drainage enhancement at the bottom of the container. So planting, if you're working with cactus or mean type plants, you can defend yourself with different tongs or nice thick gloves, thick newspaper coiled around the plant, or even some old hose pieces if you're working with very large cactus specimens can be a help to protect yourself. When we're working with succulents, it is best if you can remove the soil a few days before planting. Just loosely, gently shake that soil away from the root system. Let those thick roots kind of callus for a few days, set them out of direct sun, and then they'll be ready to plant. This way you can have homogeneous soil around the root system of your plants. Unfortunately, we can't do this with our leafy traditional plants. They are not accepting of having their more fragile root systems exposed. You do want to have a nice root system. If the roots are overgrown on the plant that you're using, make sure that you loosen those roots, or if necessary, prune the root systems. You might want to finish off to be decorative You might want to finish off by covering your potting soil with some type of what we call a top dressing. You could use gravel, which is very often used, or these more decorative smooth rocks. And I've seen people use some actually kind of creative and fun things, such as these seed pods from some of our plants, like the Texas mountain laurel. A nice layer of those will help keep the soil from splashing out of the container. Here's somebody used old coffee beans. I suppose they brewed their coffee first. But that, it's not necessary, but that can help hold moisture in the soil a little bit more. It can help keep the soil from splashing out if somebody is watering, or if a heavy rain comes in contact with that soil. So it can be a benefit. So when you're watering, make sure you thoroughly moisten all of the soil in your container. So to do that, to accomplish that, you're going to want to have that drainage hole so any excess will drain out. You can hand water, or you could use some irrigation tubing. Here we have some inline emitter tubing, that the 1/4 inch or spaghetti tubing, and they've just kind of strung it around the container here, or you could have it come up. Ideally, it's nice if you can plan ahead, and if this container won't be moved, you could send that spaghetti tube up through the drainage hole before you get started, and then you won't have the visual of that spaghetti tubing. But either way is fine. You might want to have a saucer under the container if it's in a location that might be stained by excess water, but you have to be careful with watering, because if you water over thoroughly and water escapes from that saucer, it's still going to be leaving the minerals on your perhaps patio surface. The other thing is, you don't want to have this water standing for any length of time in that saucer. As far as fertilizing, most of your plants, if you're using desert adapted plants, you might fertilize a few times during the growing season. I love personally using the organic fertilizers. They're a little bit more mild, and whether you're using organic or synthetic, I recommend maybe watering or fertilizing every few weeks during the growing season of the plants, with even a half dilution of your normal recommended amount of the fertilizer. So now I'm going to run through a nice series of plants that you might consider. A lot of these, as I say, are plants that we very often use in our landscapes, but they can be translated into beautiful container plants. Now, with our plants in the containers, putting them into a container kind of bonsais the plants, even though we're not doing bonsai or talking about bonsai. But what happens is, the effect of being in the container, the plants don't grow as rapidly, and they won't get as large as they would if they had free soil out in the landscape to develop into. So here we have some columnar cacti, the Sanita, and the Oregon pipe that are native to the southwestern part of our state. They can be very nice upright elements in the landscape, and their blooms seasonally can be very, very attractive, and even be luring in hummingbirds with their nectar that they offer. The Mexican fence post, this is one that it does have spines on these ribs, but they're generally very short and not too menacing. But still, you want to make sure that they're not in a place that people will be brushing against them too much. Now here, if you've got more open space, you can have something that's more spiny, such as this Stenoserius, that will take on very commonly dramatic purple coloring during the winter months in response to the cold temperatures. For shade, this is a wonderful columnar or upright growing cactus, this Clysto Cactus. The blooms on it are very narrow, tubular in form, just beautiful, beautiful. The added benefit, these will be visited by hummingbirds. So this is one that you don't want it to be out in direct sun, especially in a container. It's nice for maybe a morning sun, afternoon setting, or very, very bright light, such as under the Aloe Vera or even a mesquite perhaps. For full sun locations, things like our prickly pears are ideal. The purple prickly pear is nice because it doesn't grow as aggressively or as huge as some of the relative prickly pears, and it also offers the lovely feature of the coloring of the pads more accentuated. During the winter months you get a deeper purple color, but year round you just have this beautiful form and color. In the spring, these brilliant yellow flowers that accent the color of the pads as well. Here's a nice combination of agaves that are combined in this planter. And here's a little accent that during the spring will bring some color. It's one of the pink Harry's Penstemon. So of course, here again, these agaves can't stay in this container forever. Some of them are even outgrowing the container already, but you can have fun with combinations of different types of plants. More euphorbias. Remember, milky sap, don't want people bumping into these, but these are ideal for patio settings where maybe you have a lath covering, where they won't be getting direct sun, especially midday and afternoon during the summer months, but they still need, some bright light or morning sun, and just some beautiful forms. And euphorbias, they come in all shapes and sizes, so you can have these columnar forms like our native columnar cacti, or this is another type of the pencil plant that seasonally during the winter especially will have vivid kind of yellow or orange or reddish coloring on the stem tips. More euphorbias. These you can find these, they're different species that, and different variations of these, the Euphorbia Milia. Some have very large leaves, others very small. You can find types of these that have beautiful red blooms or pink blooms, or some of them have kind of a cream colored bloom. So another type of plant that can be a very nice accent for a patio area. This is a beautiful succulent plant that has flowers that almost look like the Plumeria flowers. Now this is a rather young specimen, but this will grow quite tall, be upright in form once it gets going. Here, this is a fun hanging planter plant. The Sarcostemma, the rope plant, has just these stems that are like string or rope, and just a nice kind of fun form to use. When these bloom, this is about the size of a quarter. This little cluster of blooms, they are so sweetly fragrant. Here you have another one of these Sarcostemmas, some different aloes and euphorbias. A nice setting here. With this exposure, it gets a little bit of morning sun, but then afternoon shade. Now, ponytail plants can be wonderful candidates for container gardens. The ponytail plant gets this really interesting widened base called the caudex, and they will generally branch. Some people might train them to be a little bit more single stemmed until they get taller, but you can have these in a range from light shade to morning sun, afternoon shade, or even once they get acclimated, they can even be exposed to full day sun. So just keep in mind the care of your plants. This one looking a little droopy. So look for those signs. This one's saying, hello, I need some water. You want to make sure that we keep our plants healthy so that they can resist any type of insect or disease problems. Here we have the perennial, the Mexican Petunia. These come in a range of colors from the purple to the white to even pink. Depending on the nursery that you visit, they might have different colors available. These will have upright stems. Just a word of caution, if you've got your container in a cold area, they might look pretty scrappy during the winter. But otherwise, they have beautiful elongated dark green leaves, and all through the summer months, they'll provide these beautiful flowers. Lavenders are great. You have to make sure that you have a super well draining potting soil. I usually recommend that people use a cactus mix when they want to have their lavenders in containers, because they are so finicky about proper drainage. But we've got so many different lavenders available. Some get pretty large, others stay shorter in stature, and any of these would be nice for attracting butterflies and hummingbirds and pollinator bees to your gardens. Here we have a wonderful, what's typically used as a ground cover, a plant that can be wonderful for kind of spilling over large containers. During the spring, especially in the fall, you have these clusters of beautiful pea-like flowers that will attract butterflies to your garden. Very soft textured here with these what we call compound leaves, very delicate looking, but this is a super drought tolerant plant and does best in full sun locations. The Angelina Daisy is a little perennial that blooms practically year round with these wonderful golden yellow daisy-like flowers. They have almost grass-like leaves, so you've got a nice greenery there. And this flower is similar to our native desert marigold, but I would strongly recommend that you not try growing our native desert marigold in containers. They are so finicky about drainage that, especially during the summer, most likely you would overwater them and cause them to rot. The Angelina Daisy is a little bit more, easygoing and flexible in the soil moisture. These are great in full sun to light shade. Grasses, we have some fabulous perennial, Southwest native perennial bunch grasses that are just awesome elements to use in containers, especially this bamboo muley. These leaves, they're very fine, narrow, and the stems are elongated and just kind of arch over after they get height to them. Just a very soft texture that is wonderful for containers as well as going in the ground. And here, just as I mentioned before with some examples, trying to pick up and kind of carry over what might be in a large planter or in the landscape, carrying over that form, that continuity with the plants in your containers. Yellow bells. There are so many different tacomas that are available these days, a range of beautiful colors, yellows, kind of peach colors to orange or almost red. They're all great candidates for containers. Just want to make sure with your containers that they're big enough. We can use smaller containers for a lot of our succulents, smaller and more shallow. When we're working with our leafy plants, though, we want to make sure that we have a little deeper container, and it is best to keep plants more comfortable during the summer to have a container that's generally about 2 feet in width. That will give you a big enough soil mass that will hold moisture longer and also won't get as hot as a smaller container situation. Nice for shade. These are great shade plants. These Xamia culcas, some people call them the Z plants. They have these dark green, almost glossy leaves that are ideal. These do not want to be in the sun. So they're great house plants, but also wonderful for patio or courtyard situations where you've got a covering overhead and they won't be exposed to sun. And here we have a container with elephant food. This is one of the most adaptable plants. You can throw these even in a container out in full sun or light to even moderate shade, and they're happy as can be. Beautiful, beautiful Queen Victoria cactus or agave with a planter of cactus. Here, kind of this wide staircase going up to the house. These are ideal, giving you nice form and texture and color range. The planters here accenting some seating walls, some walled seating areas. I love this agave. It just really picks up the color with these tiles and the painting, the color of the bench itself. But this is a container you'd want to have off to the side where people most likely would not be sitting. It's a beautiful accent for this area. These are a little more friendly. The totem pole cactus that doesn't have spines and the aloe plant here. So if somebody does bump into one of those, they're not going to get scratched or worse, poked. So keep that in mind. With this pool setting, these agaves are just magnificent features, such low maintenance. Now this is fine for adults generally, but a lot of times, kids can get rambunctious around pools, even though we told them don't run. They get tempted. So something like this that has sharp leaf tips might not be the best, and also has, might have teeth on the leaf margins. So, again, assessing what type of activity will be in the area can help steer you to the best plant. Here, a little more friendly. In this corner, you can see there's, you can see the chair here, but there's a little, patio table. So this isn't too much of a risk, offering too much of a risk of somebody getting harmed if they do bump into that. Remember the lighting. The aloe veras, they don't do the best, especially in containers, in all-day sun exposure, but you want to make sure that they have sufficient light so they don't get all leggy and lose their potential for a good bloom. This one, it's getting morning sun and then afternoon shade in this location, which is ideal. Here we have containers that kind of, with the plants, they play off of what we have in the ground, in the landscape. This beautiful agave, you follow through, you've got some agaves here, and there's some more around the corner in the landscape. And with this container, it is filled with some beautiful Sandpaper Verbena, a nice kind of ground cover perennial type plant. Well, that kind of plays with the verbena that's planted in the ground, although it's a different type. But the nice thing about this is it's a good sized planter. It is over 1.5 feet, I think almost 2 feet wide. So it's got nice, soil capacity there to accommodate this perennial plant. But it's not so huge. You could put it on a dolly and move it seasonally if need be. This can get crispy if it's exposed to temperatures, mid-20s. So if it's getting to be too cold for a stretch of time, you might even just want to move it to a more sheltered location. So there again, thinking, as a container, is it so big it's going to be stationary, forever basically, or smaller ones might seasonally be moved around if needed. So with the elephant food that I mentioned before, again, so versatile. These are lovely as hanging planter material. And here in these big pots on this wall here, as they grow, they'll just kind of cascade over, being just a lovely feature in this landscape. Here they're combined with other plants in this pot with the totem pole, and here with that slipper plant and some aloe. This is actually the same house. This is the front, approaching the front door, and this is off of a back patio. So they kind of carried through, it's different container, but carried through with the theme of their plants. Here you see the blue elf, aloe in bloom, and totally different setting, but here's just another planter of blue elf. It's been in this planter for years, so these do clump a little bit, but they can remain in these container for several years. So I hope you've gotten an idea of things that you need to really consider in using container plants and container gardenings in your patio areas or in your landscape itself, and how to approach choosing the plants, choosing the container, caring for them, and so forth. So thank you so much. And do we have any questions?
Well, so far you've been so thorough that we don't.
Oh,
but we do have a few minutes left. So in case anyone is enthusiastically typing away on their question.
And I will mention, your container gardens don't actually have to have live plants in them. This is atop a mailbox way at the end of the driveway, and water wasn't accessible, but it's a lovely accent using that metal sculpture prickly pear. Well, if we don't have any questions, I just really encourage you to think about using some containers in your settings. And we're kind of rounding off. You might still catch some plant sales at some botanical institutions, but truly, if you visit some of our local retail nurseries, they have just a wonderful array of desert adapted plants that you could utilize in your container gardens. Well, thank you all.